Judge not, lest you be judged. You ever heard anybody apply that verse to you? You ever been trying to tell a person about God and explaining to him who Jesus Christ is and what Jesus Christ has done? And then they throw that verse. And some Christians, I don't think, know what to do with that verse. Because when they read their Bible, they just look at that statement and they go, oh, I guess I'm not supposed to judge. And it's a good example of, number one, taking a verse out of its context. And second of all, misapplying it, which is really what you oftentimes do. When you take a verse out of context, it's often because you want to apply it to something it's not really about. And that's exactly what we're going to take a look at. We're going to look at several statements with regard to judgment for you, as well as Jesus' instructions about judging that he's going to speak here in the Sermon on the Mount. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're looking at how to read your Bible, how we understand it. And we've been contrasting some things that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, because it's probably one of the trickier places to handle, I think, for a lot of Christians, because there's a lot of Christians that think, well, we're not under the law, so we don't have that Sabbath, we get that, and we don't have that tithing, and we don't have all those dietary restrictions, which we haven't even really considered those in these studies. But when we come to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, everybody's like, but this is Jesus. Aren't we supposed to do everything that comes out of his mouth? And we've already been demonstrating there's some things he says at one time and then it's different at another time. And we're going to look at one of those today, that not necessarily is it so different as it is they're trying to apply different things at the same time. In Matthew chapter 7, in verse 1, Jesus says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. If we stop there, sounds like a great verse to try to put everybody in their place. Although kind of when people are throwing that verse out there and saying, don't judge lest you be judged, they're kind of being judgy themselves. Verse 2, for in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by the standard of measure, it will be measured out to you. Now, this is consistent with the standard under law. We saw this in our last video where Jesus said, if you forgive men their trespasses against you, then God will forgive you yours. But that's not the way it works with us. What God's doing with us as believers today is that we're encouraged to deal graciously with others in the same way that God has dealt graciously with us. That's not forgiving so that we can be forgiven. That is not the way God forgives us. He forgives us based on faith and based on who Jesus Christ is or what Jesus has done. Verse 3 then, he says, why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log or the beam that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Notice, if you just keep on reading, Jesus is saying, don't judge lest you be judged, because, well, you've got a major problem. You're trying to take a little speck of dust out of somebody's eye, a little wood chip, a little wood fiber, and you've got massive beams that are sticking out of the eye, and they're bang, bang. How can you see? How could you do that? He's using, obviously, the metaphor of if you had beams stuck in your eye, how hard that would be to see somebody else's need. But then we take that and go from there, and Jesus says, so take the beam out of your eye so that you can help take the speck out of your... Now what is he saying? When he says, if you're going to take the speck out of your brother's eye, then you are sort of judging him. But it's only after you've dealt with your problem first. So Jesus isn't making an absolute don't judge anymore. He's trying to say, if you judge and you've got a major problem, well, the standard you use to judge them, that's going to be used on you, and your problem's even worse. So he's saying, address your problem. Then you can help others. And helping them would be a lot different than just going around judging people. And Paul talks about in similar ways over in Romans chapter 2 about people that were religious and went about judging other people, especially people using the law. And then he says, in the same regard, in verse 6, do not give what is holy to the dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under feet and turn and tear you. So what he's talking about here, and you go, what does this have to do? He was just talking about judging. He says a lot of times what happens when these people get into this, the people they go after, the people they're handling, it's like you're throwing holy things to dogs. Now, this is crazy because our culture today, everybody loves dogs. People are dog people. They call them they're like their kids and grandkids and such. But dogs in many cultures in the world, though they lived around people and people sort of had dogs, dogs were considered rather indiscriminate creatures. I lost a game once because I named dogs as man's best friend, something to that effect as a proverb for another country. And the other people that were, nobody chose my idea. Nobody did. And when we finished that round, I said, I can't believe nobody chose mine. Well, the problem was all those people I was playing with had all spent time for a number of years, lived for a number of years in Asia. And as you go to Asia, nobody likes dogs. Dogs are filthy and they're dirty and they're indiscriminate. Okay. So this is what Jesus is getting at. You've got to change our attitude about the way we love dogs to the way many cultures have viewed dogs as rather these indiscriminate creatures, and you're giving them a holy thing and they don't care. That holy thing is no different to them than roadkill. Okay? Give it an idea. And don't throw your pearls before swine. What are they going to do? They're just going to see them. They're going to sniff at them. It's not food, and they're just going to trample them into the dirt where they lay. And they're just going to tear you to pieces. And I think what he's getting at is if you try to help somebody in judgment, you better be careful who you're trying to help and who you're judging, because those very people are going to turn on you. Those very people are going to actually be after you. And this is what Jesus is getting at. But remember, he's speaking to Israel about their kingdom and in anticipation of their kingdom, how they should be thinking and living. I want to jump ahead to a statement that we have in John chapter 7. Jesus says in John chapter 7, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with a righteous judgment. In other words, they're looking outwardly, just that's all they see is outwardly. So some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, is this not the man whom they were seeking to kill? And they're looking at him because he's speaking so openly, and it's like, and yet he's just telling them, don't judge us by appearance. You need to really engage. In fact, at the end of the chapter, in John chapter 7, we have Nicodemus speaking up here, and it says in verse 51, our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him. See, it's not just by his appearance. Let's sit down and talk, and let's find out what actually happened. Maybe it appears you did something wrong, but maybe I didn't see it right, so let's talk about it. Unless it hears from him and knows what he is doing, does it? And then they, of course, get incensed because they've already made up their minds that this Jesus is wrong. And they answered him, you are not also from Galilee, are you? Search and see, no prophet arises out of Galilee. All of this is very important because Jesus has been addressing the issue of judgment. One of their own part of that council they've been trying to talk to Jesus, he says we should hear him. That's what proper judgment should be, which is exactly what Jesus had said up above, that don't judge by appearance. You got to get down a little deeper. But in John chapter 8, when he's talking with these people, he says, you are judging according to the flesh. I'm not judging anybody. Now, what does he mean judging according to the flesh? He's talking about not a motive, not a direction, instruction from God. We're talking about our own human instinct and drives. It's like, I don't like that. I don't like that person. I don't like what they did. So I'm going to deal with them. And they're judging out of the flesh. And you see this a lot in John, as well as the other Gospels, that these people, they don't like what Jesus is doing. They feel threatened by Jesus. And so they're trying to find some reason to get him. And their judgment, everything they're doing, Jesus is indicating, it's off. It's selfish. Now, with regard to judgment, I want to look at a couple statements specifically addressed to you and I. And in Romans chapter 14, he's talking about the question about whether believers have to keep a Sabbath day or not, or whether believers can eat meat or they should eat only vegetables. And we've talked about these issues before. We're not going to settle the questions that Paul's getting, but what he says is, who are you to judge the servant of another? In other words, that kind of says, leave it open. Some people are going to keep Sabbath and some aren't. Some are going to be vegetarians for religious reasons and some are going to enjoy eating meat. He says, but who are you then to judge the servant of another? Because when you're talking about keeping Sabbath or not, eating meat or being a vegetarian, these are for religious reasons and it's a matter of motive. I can't see the heart of that individual that is doing this. And this is exactly what Paul is trying to say. Our job is not to judge motives, because you and I don't know the motives of other people. Unless they open their mouth and say, boy, because I eat only vegetables, God likes me a lot more than he likes all those people that eat meat. Now you kind of probably have a motive. But most people aren't that open about those kinds of issues. And so this is what he's talking about. Don't judge motives. We go to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, and again, he's talking about motives. And if we go back up here in the context, let's go back up to verse 1. Let a man regard us in this manner as servants of Christ and stewards or managers of the mysteries of God. In this case, moreover, it's required of stewards or managers that they be found trustworthy. You don't hire somebody to manage your business if they're not trustworthy and they're going to abscond with the things you have or pilfer for themselves. Verse 3, but to me it is a very small thing that I may be examined by you, or by, we have this human court, literally it's man's day, but we'll just go with human court for the time being. In fact, he says, I don't even examine or judge or evaluate myself. Paul says, I don't even go around trying to go, are my motives right? Are my motives right? You could spend a lot of time trying to evaluate your motives, believer, trying to figure out, are you doing the right thing or are you doing the wrong thing? For the wrong, or doing the right thing maybe, but for the wrong motive. And I knew a believer a number of years ago that says, I don't think I can participate in that because I just can't get my motives right. And I was like, just serve and get your motives straight. You have the choice to get your motives in the right order, in the right place. But Paul says, so I don't go around doing that. I just serve. For he says, for I am conscious of nothing against myself, but I'm not acquitted or declared righteous. But the one who examines me, that is the Lord. Therefore, do not go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things that are hidden in darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. And then each man's praise will come to him from God. In other words, I can't judge what's going on in your heart. I can only judge actions. And he does tell us to judge actions. If we go on down over to chapter 5, we have a man that's living in immorality. We talked about this just the other day. And if we go down to the end of this chapter, he says, verse 11, but I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother. I don't like the word so-called. Literally, it's one named brother. If he is an immoral person, covetous, or idolater, or a reviler, that is, they harshly ridicule people, or a drunkard or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. That's judgment. Do you see that? So Jesus says, judge not that thou shalt be judged. But Jesus then goes on, take care of your problem, and then you can help or judge that person. Paul over here is saying, stop judging the world, but deal with believers, that they're called a brother, but it's plain that they're doing these things. That's judgment. Don't judge motives, Paul says, back in 1 Corinthians 4, but down here in chapter 5, he does say, he doesn't actually use the word judge, but he says, in this context, he's implying it, and then he goes on in verse 12, for what have I to do with judging the outsiders? And I've said this before. This is where the Christian has given ourselves just a black eye in the world. We spend all our time yelling at the world, yelling at our government, yelling at social institutions, and we just rage against these people. In fact, I got in an airplane probably 20 years ago, and I had a gal that sat down next to me. And she was from another religion. Her family had immigrated here from Asia, and she sat down, and she just asked if she could ask me some questions. She quickly found out that I was a believer. I didn't sit there and go, hey, I'm a Christian, I'm going to talk to you about... I didn't do that at all. She started asking me questions. She found out I was a Christian. She said, could I ask some questions? Oh, sure. And I'm thinking, oh, we'll see how this will go. First question, why are Christians always so angry? And you know what? I had to talk to her about, I don't know why everybody else is angry, but honestly, a lot of Christians are angry because they're focusing on the wrong things. And I had to tell her, whatever reason those people are angry, and I don't think it's the way we're supposed to live, this is what Jesus Christ says. This is who the gospel is. This is who Jesus Christ is. And we shouldn't have to be doing that as Christians. But a lot of times we are, especially in our modern culture, because there's a lot of Christians raging against the system. And he says, do you not judge those within the church? Right there, Paul says, we do judge those within the church. Now, I don't think we should be going around judging everybody all the time. And we're going to come back and look at this with another statement that Jesus makes in the Sermon on the Mount. But today, just to stop and think, in that context, judge not lest you be judged had to do with activities and motives of other people without knowing why. And we as believers, even when we're dealing with other believers, we should talk to them and find out why it appears that they did this or that. But we are told to judge. We're told when not to judge and when we should judge. And Jesus really, to be honest, kind of says the same thing. There's a proper time to judge and there's a proper background for not judging. And you guys are doing that right now. So again, as we're looking at this, there's contrasts between what Jesus was saying and what we're told as members of the body of Christ, the church. Think about that. Think about what it means for us to live today as part of the body of Christ and to live not being judgy people. There are appropriate times, but this should not be something that that we're characterized by. And that we ought to be people that are kind and gracious with others, believers and even unbelievers. Have a great day in the Lord, and thank you for joining me.